The day after my father's funeral, I watched my Uncle Tom throw away the last letter my dad had ever written to me. Why would he destroy it instead of handing it over? Why did he insist my father had changed his mind only hours before he died? And why was the envelope stamped certified mail if it supposedly meant nothing? I still remember Tom looking straight at me and saying, "Some things are better left buried with the dead." I believed the truth disappeared with that garbage truck until a USPS mail carrier knocked on my door that same evening and quietly asked, "Ms. Kimberly Simpson, did anyone ever give you your father's certified letter? If you're listening from somewhere outside the US, I'd love to know what country you're watching from. And tell me your local time too. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach." If you enjoy thoughtful family stories about truth, justice, and healing, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. I barely slept that night. After Daniel Ruiz left my apartment, the silence felt heavier than it had since my father's funeral. His question kept replaying in my head. Did anyone ever give you your father's certified letter? He hadn't accused anyone. He hadn't suggested a crime. He had simply asked a question that shouldn't have existed if Uncle Tom had been telling the truth. When I answered no, Daniel had hesitated before speaking again. "I probably shouldn't speculate," he said carefully, "but your father was very particular about that mailing." Those words stayed with me until sunrise. By 8:30 the next morning, I was standing outside the main USPS distribution office in Columbus. Daniel met me in the lobby wearing the same calm expression he'd had the night before. He looked like someone who had spent decades watching people's lives unfold through envelopes and packages without ever becoming numb to what they carried. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I need to understand what happened." "So do I." He led me through a secure door and introduced me to Karen Ellis, the operations supervisor. Karen was in her early 50s with silver-framed glasses and the kind of composed demeanor that comes from solving problems without drama. She offered me a seat. "Mr. Ruiz told me about your situation, Miss Simpson. I don't want anyone breaking rules because of me." "We won't," she replied. "Everything we discuss today comes from official postal procedures." That answer alone made me feel a little safer. Karen placed a folder on the table. "Do you know how certified mail works?" "I know you have to sign for it." "That's the part most people know." She opened the folder and slid over a sample tracking form. Certified mail creates documentation from the moment it's accepted until delivery is completed. Every transfer is recorded. Every signature is retained. That's why attorneys, courts, financial institutions, and people handling important personal matters often choose it. My father wasn't a lawyer. "No," Daniel said quietly, "but he understood documentation." Karen nodded. "Your father mailed one certified letter 3 days before entering hospice." My chest tightened. "So he really did send it?" "He did." I looked down at the paperwork. There it was. My father's name, the mailing date, the destination, my address, the tracking number, nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just facts. Somehow that hurt even more. "He wanted me to receive it." Karen gave a sympathetic smile. "Yes." I swallowed. "Then how did Uncle Tom end up with it?" Karen folded her hands. "That's where things become complicated." She couldn't simply print every document because federal privacy rules applied. Instead, she walked me through the chain of custody. The envelope had been accepted at the counter. It had moved through processing overnight. It reached the Columbus delivery unit. Then delivery was interrupted. "Interrupted?" I asked. Daniel answered. "Someone contacted the Postal Service before delivery." "Who?" Karen shook her head. "I can't identify individuals without the appropriate legal authority." My stomach dropped. "So that's it?" "Not necessarily." Just then, my attorney, Melissa Grant, arrived. Melissa had handled probate matters for my father years earlier and was now representing me in the estate proceedings. She greeted Karen with a handshake. "I appreciate your time." Karen immediately became more comfortable discussing procedures. Melissa reviewed the documents carefully without saying much. She wasn't looking for dramatic revelations. She was looking for inconsistencies. After nearly 10 minutes, she pointed at one entry. "Can you explain this notation?" Karen leaned over. "This indicates someone claimed authority to receive estate-related correspondence before final delivery." Melissa looked at me. "Did your father appoint Tom as executor?" "No. The will names both of us as co-representatives until probate." Melissa nodded slowly. "So your uncle had some authority, but not unlimited authority." Daniel added another detail. I remember your father asking me something when he mailed it." "What?" "He asked whether certified mail created proof even if someone tried to interfere." I stared at him. "You remember that?" "I do." "What did you tell him?" "I said the Postal Service documents every step." Daniel looked genuinely uncomfortable. He smiled. My throat tightened. He said, "Good. Paper remembers better than people do." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Melissa finally broke the silence. "That sounds like a man anticipating resistance." Karen carefully turned another page. "We also retained signature images." She enlarged one record on her monitor. "There." A digital signature. According to the file, someone had accepted responsibility for the mailing. Melissa leaned closer. "May I?" Karen rotated the monitor toward us. Melissa studied every line, every curve, every date. She wasn't trying to recognize handwriting. She was reading context. Finally, she asked, "Could I have the delivery timestamp?" Karen pointed to another field. 10:43 in the morning. Melissa wrote it down. Then she asked one more question. "Do you know where Mr. Thomas Simpson was that day?" I answered immediately. "Chicago." Melissa looked at me. "You're certain?" "He gave a speech at a regional construction conference." I remember because he talked about it for weeks. He posted photos. The funeral guests even mentioned how he'd rushed back after the conference. Melissa remained silent. She checked her notes. She opened her laptop. Within moments, she found the conference program, Thomas Simpson, featured speaker, Chicago, 10:30 that same morning. Almost the exact time someone had supposedly accepted responsibility for my father's certified letter in Columbus. Karen frowned. "That doesn't necessarily prove anything." "No," Melissa agreed. "It proves something much more useful." "What?" Melissa turned the screen toward me. "If these records are accurate, your uncle couldn't have been standing at the post office in Columbus at 10:43 that morning." I felt the first real shift beneath everything I'd believed since my father's death. For days, Uncle Tom had spoken with complete confidence. He'd acted like nothing unusual had happened. He'd insisted Dad's letter was meaningless. He'd even looked me in the eyes while throwing that envelope into a trash bag. Now there was a documented timeline that refused to cooperate with his version of events. Melissa closed her notebook. "I don't think we're looking at a missing letter anymore." I frowned. "What are we looking at?" She gathered the paperwork into a neat stack. "I think we're looking at someone whose story depends on nobody comparing dates." As we prepared to leave, Karen printed one final page that Melissa was legally entitled to receive as part of the estate inquiry. Melissa read it once, then a second time. Without another word, she slipped it into her briefcase. I recognized the look on her face. It wasn't satisfaction. It was curiosity. The careful kind that appears when one small inconsistency suggests there may be 10 more waiting underneath. Outside the building, I finally asked the question that had been haunting me all morning. "Melissa, what did you just find?" She unlocked her car but didn't get inside. Instead, she looked directly at me. "Kimberly, either your uncle somehow accepted that certified mail while speaking at a conference nearly 300 miles away." She paused. Or someone has been lying about what really happened to your father's final letter." I spent the next 3 days doing something my uncle had always discouraged. I stopped asking people what they remembered. I started asking them what they had kept. There's a difference. Memories soften with time. Documents don't. When my father, Robert Simpson, was alive, he had a habit that used to make everyone laugh. Every evening before he went to bed, he'd sit at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and write down everything important that had happened that day. Appointments, phone calls, bills he'd paid, letters he'd mailed, tools he'd loaned to neighbors. Sometimes he'd even write down which flowers had started blooming in the backyard. My mother used to tease him. "If the house ever catches fire, you'll probably run back in for that notebook." Dad would grin and answer the same way every time. "No, I'd run back in for the next blank one." Back then, it seemed like one of his harmless little quirks. Now I wondered if it had been something much more practical. Melissa agreed. If your father documented his life this carefully, chances are he documented the weeks before his death, too. That became our next objective. Finding whatever records my father had left behind before anyone else had a chance to remove them. Fortunately, Uncle Tom had already emptied most obvious filing cabinets after the funeral. Unfortunately for him, Dad never trusted obvious places. The garage was exactly as he'd left it. His workbench still smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. Every screwdriver hung in perfect order. Every drawer carried handwritten labels. Nothing looked disturbed. I stood there for several minutes before opening anything. Not because I expected treasure. Because I wasn't ready to accept he wasn't coming back. Melissa quietly waited near the doorway. "You don't have to rush. I know. You can stop any time. I also know that." I opened the first drawer. Sandpaper, the second, wood glue, the third, receipts for hardware purchases dating back almost 10 years. Everything was organized. Painfully organized. My father had always believed that if something mattered enough to keep it, mattered enough to label. After nearly an hour, we still hadn't found anything connected to the certified letter. Then Melissa noticed something. "Kimberly!" "What?" She pointed toward the old wall calendar hanging beside the workbench. It hadn't been replaced since Dad became sick. Every square was filled with tiny handwritten notes. Doctor. Prescription refill. Call Kim. Pay utilities. Feed birds. Nothing unusual, until Melissa traced her finger across the final month. There. One date had been circled twice. Beside it, my father had written only 4 words. Mail letter. Keep receipt. Not mail paperwork. Not send documents. Just mail letter. The same day listed on the USPS records. Melissa photographed the calendar. That confirms he intentionally mailed something important, but not what it contained. No. It confirms something else. What? He expected to need proof. That sentence stayed with me. Proof. Not hope. Not trust. Proof. My father had apparently believed that someday someone might question whether the letter had ever existed. He had prepared for that possibility. We searched another hour. Still nothing. As we packed our things, my phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Simpson." "Yes." "This is Grace Morgan from Evergreen Hospice." My stomach tightened. "I'm calling because Attorney Grant requested access to portions of your father's visitor records." "Yes." I located everything. There was a brief pause. I also found something unusual. Melissa motioned for me to put the phone on speaker. Grace continued. During Mr. Simpson's final 3 weeks, he repeatedly asked our staff whether his daughter had received an important letter. I closed my eyes. He asked more than once, quite a few times. Did anyone answer him? We told him we had no way of knowing. Grace hesitated. There was another pattern. What pattern? He often became anxious after visits from one specific family member. I already knew the answer. Tom. Yes. According to the nursing notes, my father appeared calm before Tom arrived. After each visit, he became restless. Sometimes he requested to see the charge nurse. Sometimes he asked whether outgoing mail had already been collected. One note especially caught Melissa's attention. Grace read it aloud. Patient states, if my daughter says she never received the certified letter, don't argue with her. Tell her to ask the postal service. Neither Melissa nor I spoke. I could barely breathe. Dad had known, not exactly what would happen, but enough to leave instructions. Grace continued reading. Patient appears mentally alert, oriented to person, place, time, and situation. Melissa quietly mouthed the words to herself. Mentally alert? That mattered. If Tom later argued that Dad had been confused because of medication, these nursing assessments would undermine that claim. After thanking Grace, we drove straight to Evergreen Hospice. The building felt painfully familiar. I'd spent countless evenings there holding my father's hand. Walking back inside without him was harder than attending the funeral. Grace greeted us in a private consultation room carrying a thick binder. We document everything. She carefully opened the records. Daily observations, medication logs, visitor sign-in sheets, nursing assessments, communication notes. Melissa reviewed them page by page. She wasn't reading quickly anymore. She was building a timeline. Kimberly. What? Look at the visitor log. I leaned over. The dates surprised me. Tom had repeatedly told relatives that I rarely visited Dad because I was always working, but according to Evergreen's own records, I had signed in 23 times during Dad's final month. Tom had signed in 7. I blinked. I was there more than 3 times as often. Melissa nodded. And yet everyone in your family believes the opposite. I suddenly remembered conversations after the funeral. Tom was with Robert every day. Kimberly hardly came. Tom carried the family. Those words hadn't come from different people. They'd all come from Tom first. He had repeated the same story until everyone accepted it as fact. Melissa marked several pages with sticky notes. This is important. Because he lied. Because he lied consistently. As we prepared to leave, Grace stopped us. There is one more thing. She disappeared into another office and returned carrying a small cardboard storage box. We normally return personal belongings to the family representative. My heart sank. Tom collected everything. He collected almost everything. Grace opened the box. Inside were Dad's reading glasses, his old wristwatch, a paperback novel, several greeting cards. Nothing unexpected. Then Grace reached into the bottom. There was also this. She handed me a small spiral notebook. Its blue cover was worn smooth from years of use. I recognized it instantly. Dad carried that notebook everywhere. He called it his mail log. Whenever he sent something important, he recorded where it went when he mailed it and why. My hands trembled as I opened it. Every page contained neat handwritten entries stretching back nearly 15 years. Insurance paperwork, tax documents, birthday cards, holiday gifts, everything. Then I found the final entry. The date matched the certified mail receipt exactly. Recipient Kimberly Simpson method. Certified mail status essential below that should have been the tracking number. Instead, The entire line had been torn out, not ripped by accident, removed cleanly. Someone had deliberately cut the page with a blade sharp enough to leave almost no paper fibers behind. Melissa slowly took the notebook from my hands. She examined the missing strip under the light. Then she looked at me. "Kimberly? This wasn't damaged." "I know." She carefully closed the notebook. "Someone knew exactly which piece of information they wanted to disappear." The missing strip of paper bothered me far more than I expected. It wasn't because the tracking number was gone. By now, Melissa already had that from the Postal Service. It was because someone had opened my father's private notebook after his death, flipped through years of perfectly preserved records, ignored hundreds of pages, and removed exactly one line. That wasn't panic. That was intent. Melissa slid the notebook into a protective evidence sleeve. "We're done searching by ourselves." "What do you mean?" "From this point forward, every document needs a documented chain of custody." I almost laughed. "Everything comes back to documentation." She smiled. "That's usually because documentation survives arguments." 2 days later, we met at Melissa's office. Unlike television lawyers, Melissa never built dramatic moments. Her conference room was quiet, almost boring. A long walnut table, 3 legal pads, a pitcher of water, neatly arranged folders. The only thing unusual was who had been invited. My Uncle Tom. He arrived 15 minutes early, pressed navy suit, American flag lapel pin, expensive leather briefcase, the same calm confidence he'd displayed at the funeral. When he saw me, he gave a sympathetic smile. "Kimberly. Tom. I'm sorry you've been putting yourself through all of this. I didn't choose it. You've been grieving." He sat down slowly. "Grief makes people connect dots that aren't really connected." Melissa didn't respond. She simply placed a recorder on the table. "This meeting is being documented with everyone's consent." Tom nodded. "Of course. I have nothing to hide. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed him." Melissa began simply. "Mr. Simpson, we'd like to discuss the certified mail your brother sent to Kimberly." Tom sighed. "I've already explained that." "Please explain it again." "My brother changed his mind." "When?" "The day before he died." "Did you witness that conversation?" "Yes." "Was anyone else present?" "No." Melissa wrote something down. Tom continued. "He told me he didn't want Kimberly burdened by unnecessary family conflict." I stared at him. My father spent his last weeks asking hospice nurses whether I'd received that letter. Tom looked at me with practiced sadness. "People near the end of life sometimes become confused." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because I believed him, because I knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't attacking me. He was attacking my father's credibility. Melissa anticipated it. She opened the first folder. "I'd like to discuss Mr. Robert Simpson's medical records." Tom leaned back. "What about them?" Melissa slid several copies across the table. "These are nursing assessments completed by licensed hospice staff." Tom glanced at the first page. His expression barely changed. Then Melissa highlighted one sentence. "Patient alert and oriented to person, place, time, and situation." Another page, same conclusion. Another, same conclusion. Over and over. Every assessment reached essentially the same finding. Robert Simpson understood where he was, who was visiting him, what decisions he was making. Tom slowly placed the papers down. "Medication affects people differently." Melissa nodded. "That's true." She opened another folder. "This is why nurses evaluate cognitive function every shift." More records, more signatures, more assessments. No indication of confusion. No diagnosis supporting impaired judgment. No physician's note questioning his legal capacity. Tom's smile disappeared. For the first time since entering the room, he stopped making eye contact. Melissa continued speaking in exactly the same calm tone. Did Robert ever tell you he wished to cancel the certified mail? Yes. Did he contact the postal service? No. Did he contact Attorney Grant? No. Did he write a replacement letter? No. So the only evidence supporting that claim is your memory. Tom crossed his arms. My brother trusted me. Melissa answered immediately. He also trusted certified mail. The room became very quiet. Tom shifted in his chair. You people are acting like one letter changes everything. No, Melissa replied. We're acting like someone worked very hard to make sure Kimberly never read it. Tom laughed. A missing letter. A torn notebook page. This is becoming a conspiracy. I almost answered. Melissa gently touched my arm under the table. Not yet. She wasn't finished. She opened another folder. This came from Evergreen Hospice. Tom looked bored. Until Melissa continued. It documents your brother repeatedly asking whether Kimberly had received the certified mail. Tom's face froze for less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Neither did Melissa. She calmly placed another page beside the first. This note says Robert instructed staff to tell Kimberly one thing if she never received the letter. Tom swallowed. Melissa read directly from the nursing note. If my daughter says she never received the certified letter, don't argue with her. Tell her to ask the postal service. Nobody spoke. Tom finally leaned forward. So? Melissa looked at him steadily. Why would Robert leave those instructions if he had already decided the letter shouldn't be delivered? Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his water. His hand shook just enough for the ice cubes to rattle against the glass. He took a sip before responding. I don't know what was going through his head. Melissa didn't argue. She simply wrote down his answer. Then she changed direction. Mr. Simpson, would you describe your relationship with your brother during his final year? We were close. How close? I handled many things for him. Financial matters. Sometimes. Mail. When necessary. Medical appointments. Occasionally. You helped coordinate visitors. Yes. Each answer came easily. Almost too easily. Melissa let him continue. You also informed extended family about Robert's condition. Someone had to. So, relatives relied on your updates. Naturally. Melissa nodded. I'd like to compare those updates with hospice records. Tom frowned. What do you mean? She opened yet another folder. Multiple relatives told Kimberly she rarely visited Robert. Tom looked at me. Well, Melissa interrupted. Hospice records show Kimberly signed in 23 times during Robert's final month. She slid the visitor log toward him. You visited 7. Silence. Melissa continued. Can you explain why nearly every family member believed the opposite? Tom hesitated. I never counted. You didn't have to. Another pause. I may have summarized. Melissa didn't respond. She simply made another note. Then she looked up. Mr. Simpson. Yes. Would you agree that people trusted your version of events? I suppose. And when your version conflicted with documented records, she gently tapped the hospice file. The records have consistently proven more accurate. Tom looked toward the window instead of answering. For the first time since my father's funeral, I saw uncertainty replace confidence. Not fear, not guilt. Just uncertainty. As though he had walked into the meeting expecting grief and emotion, but found paperwork instead. Melissa closed every folder except one. There is only one issue remaining today. Tom straightened. And what's that? The Postal Service maintains archive documentation beyond ordinary tracking records. His eyes narrowed. What kind of documentation? Melissa held his gaze. The kind that requires formal retrieval authorization. Tom's fingers tightened around the edge of the conference table. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Not when we discussed the destroyed envelope. Not when we discussed hospice. Not when we discussed my father's mental capacity. Only now. Only when Melissa mentioned archived postal records. She noticed it too. She didn't smile. She simply wrote one final sentence across the top of her legal pad before closing it. Then she stood. This meeting is concluded. Tom gathered his briefcase faster than he'd unpacked it. As he reached the door, he turned back. You won't find anything, Melissa answered politely. I hope you're right. After he left, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. You saw it too, didn't you? Melissa nodded. Every time we discussed your father's intentions, he stayed composed. But the moment I mentioned USPS archives, she looked toward the closed conference room door. Your uncle stopped worrying about the past. He started worrying about what still exists. 3 days later, Melissa called before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I just received the authorization. For what? The Postal Service approved access to the archived certified mail records. I immediately stood up. So we're finally going to find out what Dad mailed. Melissa paused. Maybe. That wasn't the answer I expected. I thought the archive would have the letter. It might. It might also have something just as valuable. Which is, she answered with one word, procedure. It sounded disappointing until she explained. The strength of evidence isn't always what people wrote. It's proving what happened. The USPS Regional Records Center sat in a plain government building on the outskirts of Columbus. No dramatic entrance. No rows of mysterious filing cabinets. Just secured doors, fluorescent lighting, and employees whose entire careers revolved around preserving records nobody expected to need. Daniel was already waiting for us. He wasn't officially part of the investigation anymore, but he had volunteered to help navigate the archival process. I've never seen one of these requests move this quickly, he admitted. Melissa smiled. Probate judges tend to appreciate documentation. We were escorted into a conference room by an archive specialist named Rebecca Turner. Rebecca looked like someone who enjoyed organization more than conversation. Every folder she carried was perfectly aligned. Every label was printed. She greeted us politely before laying several sealed archive boxes on the table. I want to explain exactly what we do and do not retain. Melissa nodded. Please. Rebecca opened a procedural manual. When certified mail is accepted, we preserve mailing documentation for specific periods depending on the service purchased. She pointed toward several forms. Most people purchase standard certified mail. She picked up another document. Some customers purchase additional services. She looked directly at me. Your father did. I felt my pulse quicken. What did he request? Rebecca unfolded the original mailing receipt. Certified mail. Return receipt. Restricted delivery. Then she stopped. There was one additional service. Melissa leaned forward. What was it? Rebecca carefully rotated the receipt toward us. Duplicate mailing documentation. I had never heard those words before. Melissa asked, How common is that? Rebecca smiled faintly. Rare? Why? Because most people assume the original records are enough. So why would someone request duplicate documentation? Rebecca answered without hesitation. When they believe the mailing itself may become important evidence later. The room fell silent. Dad had planned for interference. Not hoped it wouldn't happen. Planned for it. Daniel quietly shook his head. I remember now. You do. He asked the clerk whether there was any way to preserve proof if the envelope itself disappeared. My throat tightened. And the clerk explained the additional documentation option. Daniel looked down at that receipt. Your father paid for it. Melissa carefully examined every line. This doesn't prove what was inside. Rebecca agreed. No. It proves something equally significant. What? That Robert Simpson intentionally created multiple layers of documentation. Melissa looked at me. That's exactly what accountants do. I smiled despite everything. Dad always said people remember conversations differently. Melissa finished the sentence. But paperwork remembers the same way every time, Rebecca continued. There is one more item. She reached for a sealed archival envelope bearing several security labels. This remained sealed because delivery was officially classified as incomplete. I looked at Melissa. What does that mean? She answered before Rebecca could. It means whatever is inside was never released. My heartbeat became almost painfully loud. Rebecca didn't immediately hand us the envelope. Instead, she read from another document. Release requires confirmation from the estate's legal representative. Melissa produced the probate authorization. Rebecca reviewed every page carefully. She compared signatures, dates, court seals. Only after several minutes did she nod. The authorization is sufficient. She slid the sealed archival package onto the table. It wasn't large, about the size of a legal envelope. Cream-colored. Official USPS archive tape crossed both sides. No one spoke. I stared at it. Somewhere inside that package might be the last words my father had ever intended for me. Or nothing. Melissa noticed my hesitation. You don't have to open it immediately. I've waited almost 2 weeks. You've actually waited much longer than that? She was right. Without realizing it, I'd been waiting ever since Dad first became sick. Waiting for answers, waiting for honesty, waiting for someone to tell me the whole truth. Rebecca interrupted my thoughts. Before you proceed, she opened another file. There was one irregularity. Melissa immediately looked up. What kind of irregularity? Rebecca turned several pages. Our internal review notes indicate someone attempted to inquire about this archive documentation shortly after Mr. Simpson's death. I froze. Who? I'm sorry. I can't identify individuals from inquiry logs. Melissa didn't seem disappointed. What can you tell us? The inquiry was denied. Why? The requester lacked proper authorization. When? Rebecca checked the date. The morning after Mr. Simpson's funeral. Melissa slowly wrote the date down. I didn't need to check my calendar. I already knew exactly where Uncle Tom had been that morning. He'd told everyone he was meeting with the funeral director to settle final expenses. Instead, someone had tried accessing USPS archive records. Someone who wasn't legally allowed to. Melissa asked another question. Did the requester identify what they were seeking? Rebecca nodded. Yes. She opened the final page. The inquiry specifically referenced one certified mail item addressed to Kimberly Simpson. The room became very still. Daniel looked at me. Rebecca looked at Melissa. Nobody had to say Tom's name. The timing spoke for itself. Melissa finally broke the silence. This changes things. It does. It suggests whoever destroyed the envelope wasn't satisfied. What do you mean? She tapped the inquiry report. If someone believed every copy had already been destroyed, they wouldn't spend the morning after the funeral searching government archives. That realization settled over me like cold rain. Throwing away the envelope hadn't been enough. Whoever had done it had continued looking, searching, trying to erase every remaining trace. Melissa gently rested her hand on the sealed package. "I think we're very close." Rebecca nodded. "So do I." I reached for the envelope. My fingers brushed the official seal. Years of accounting had taught me to stay calm under pressure, but nothing in my career prepared me for holding what might be my father's final attempt to reach me. Just before I broke the seal, Melissa stopped me. "One more thing." "What?" She pointed to a small handwritten notation on the archive inventory sheet. It hadn't been made by a postal employee. It was my father's own handwriting copied onto the service request when he mailed the package. Only 5 words. Simple, neat, completely in his handwriting. "Open only if delivery fails." I stared at those words until they blurred. Dad hadn't simply prepared for bad luck. He had prepared for someone to make sure his letter never reached me, and somehow he had already known exactly what I would need to find after he was gone. For almost a full minute, no one moved. The sealed archival package rested in front of me untouched. I had imagined reading my father's final words countless times during the past 2 weeks. In every version, it happened alone. At home, maybe sitting at his old kitchen table, never inside a government records room with my attorney, a postal archive specialist, and the mail carrier who had unknowingly become part of my father's last plan. Melissa looked at me. "This decision is yours." I nodded slowly. "I've spent my whole life listening to my dad tell me that difficult things don't become easier by waiting." She smiled gently. "That sounds like Robert?" I slid one finger beneath the security tape. The adhesive peeled away with a soft crackle that seemed impossibly loud. Then I lifted the flap. Inside was another envelope, cream-colored. My father's handwriting covered the front. To my daughter, Kimberly Simpson, I recognized every curve of every letter. Dad had always written my full name when something mattered. I swallowed hard. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Melissa quietly handed me a pair of cotton gloves. "To preserve fingerprints." She shook her head. "To preserve the paper." Even now she was thinking about evidence. Dad would have appreciated that. I carefully removed the folded pages. 3 sheets, typed. Each one personally signed by my father in blue ink. Attached to the back was a sealed plastic sleeve containing photocopies of several financial documents. Before reading, I noticed one sentence written across the top of the first page by hand. "If you're reading this copy, someone prevented the original from reaching you." Every hair on my arms stood up. He knew. Not exactly who, but he knew someone might interfere. I began reading. "Dear Kimberly, if this reaches you the ordinary way, then I've worried for nothing. If you're holding the protected copy instead, I'm sorry. That means someone I trusted has chosen control over honesty." I had to stop. My vision blurred. Melissa quietly waited. Daniel looked toward the window, giving me privacy. I took a deep breath and continued. Dad explained that after my mother's death, Uncle Tom had gradually taken over more of the family's finances. At first it seemed reasonable. Tom owned a successful construction company. He understood loans, insurance, taxes, investments. Whenever relatives needed advice, they called him. Whenever paperwork confused someone, Tom handled it. No one questioned him. Neither had my father. Then Dad began noticing patterns. Small ones. Bills paid from the wrong account. Family reimbursements that never appeared. Temporary loans that somehow became permanent. Money quietly moving between accounts with explanations that sounded reasonable individually, but troubling when viewed together. Dad admitted something that surprised me. I ignored it for years because he was my brother. That sentence hurt almost as much as everything else. Dad hadn't been blind. He had been loyal. There was a difference. The next page became much more specific. He listed dates, account numbers, check numbers, loan amounts, not huge fortunes, not millions of dollars, smaller amounts, $8,000, $12,000, $25,000. Enough that each individual transaction seemed ordinary. Together, they represented hundreds of thousands of dollars quietly borrowed from family-controlled assets over nearly 15 years. I looked at Melissa. This isn't theft. No, it's something more complicated. Dad apparently agreed. His letter continued. Thomas rarely stole. He borrowed. He delayed repayment. He shifted obligations between accounts until nobody remembered where the money originally came from. He convinced people he was solving problems that he had quietly created himself, Melissa whispered. That's why nobody noticed. Exactly. Tom had never behaved like a criminal. He behaved like the indispensable family problem solver. Every financial emergency somehow required his involvement. Every solution increased everyone's dependence on him. Dad finally explained what had changed. About 8 months before his death, he began organizing old records for tax purposes. While comparing decades of statements, he discovered inconsistencies that couldn't be explained by memory anymore. Only paperwork. He confronted Tom privately. According to the letter, Tom didn't deny everything. Instead, he asked Dad for time. He promised to untangle the accounts before anyone else found out. Dad gave him that chance. Months passed. Nothing changed. Then Dad received his diagnosis: cancer. Everything suddenly became urgent. He wrote, "When a healthy man delays difficult conversations, he believes he has another year. When a dying man delays them, he knows he's choosing silence forever." That was why he'd written the letter. Not to destroy Tom, to protect me from inheriting confusion. I reached the final page. There, Dad became deeply personal. "Kimberly, if Thomas tells you I'm confused, don't argue. If he tells you I forgave everything, ask him for documents. If he tells the family that I trusted him completely, ask who controlled the records. Truth doesn't become weaker because someone speaks louder." I wiped away another tear. Melissa quietly handed me another tissue. Dad's final paragraph surprised me most. He never once told me to sue Tom. He never demanded revenge. Instead, he wrote, "I don't want you spending years trying to punish your uncle. I want you spending your life refusing to be manipulated by him." Then came the sentence that changed everything. Everything I've described can be verified inside my old woodworking bench. I looked up immediately. "The garage," Melissa nodded. "He wasn't referring to the notebook. No, he means something else." The letter continued. "Remove the bottom center drawer. Behind it, you'll find a false back panel. Inside are ledgers, repayment schedules, correspondence, and my personal notes. I left them there because Thomas never enjoyed woodworking. Despite everything, I laughed through my tears. That sounded exactly like Dad. Even his final joke carried a practical purpose. Daniel smiled. "I wish I'd met your father longer." "You would have liked him." "I think I already do." Melissa carefully examined the plastic sleeve attached to the letter. Inside were photocopies of 3 ledger pages, several canceled checks, a handwritten repayment schedule, and one typed memorandum signed by both Robert Simpson and Thomas Simpson almost 11 years earlier. Tom acknowledged receiving a short-term family loan. He also acknowledged repayment terms. Melissa read it twice, then a third time. "This is important." "Because he signed it?" "Because the signatures match." I frowned. "What does that matter?" "It establishes a baseline." "For what?" "So nobody can later claim every financial document was forged." I hadn't even considered that possibility. Melissa had. She always seemed to be 3 steps ahead. I gathered the pages together. Dad really believed this day would come, Melissa answered quietly. I think he hoped it never would. Rebecca returned to the room carrying the release paperwork. She noticed my expression, but didn't ask what the letter said. Instead, she placed one final document in front of Melissa. This completes the archive transfer, Melissa signed. Rebecca collected the forms. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "There was one item we almost overlooked." She handed Melissa a photocopy of my father's original service request. On the bottom margin, written in blue ink beside his signature, was one additional handwritten sentence that hadn't appeared in the archived copy of the letter. Melissa read it silently, then she looked at me. "Kimberly, what is it?" She turned the page toward me. In my father's unmistakable handwriting were the words the ledgers explain the money. The envelope hidden inside the workbench explains why Thomas was desperate enough to destroy this letter. The room seemed to disappear around me. The financial records weren't the real secret. They were only the beginning. Whatever waited inside that hidden envelope was apparently the one thing my father believed Uncle Tom feared more than losing money. Melissa insisted we didn't go to my father's house immediately. My first instinct was to get in the car and drive straight to the garage. She stopped me before I reached the parking lot. "Kimberly, I know where it is." "I know you do. So why are we waiting?" "Because from this moment on, every piece of evidence needs to be collected correctly." "I trust you. This isn't about trust." She looked me directly in the eye. "It's about making sure your uncle can't later argue that we planted anything." She was right. Again. By noon, Melissa had arranged for an independent forensic accountant, David Reynolds, to meet us at my father's house. She had also hired a professional evidence photographer to document every step before anything was touched. When we arrived, the garage looked exactly as it had 3 days earlier. Sunlight spilled through the dusty windows. The smell of sawdust still lingered in the air. My father's old radio sat on a shelf beside a coffee mug that still held a handful of pencils. For a moment, I forgot why we were there. I could almost picture him standing at the workbench humming along to old country songs while sanding a piece of walnut. David gently interrupted my thoughts. "Miss Simpson." I nodded. "We're ready whenever you are." Melissa handed me a pair of gloves. "This should be you." I walked toward the workbench. According to Dad's letter, the bottom center drawer concealed a false panel. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. The drawer slid open smoothly. It contained measuring tapes, chisels, and neatly folded shop towels. Exactly what I expected. I removed everything carefully. David photographed every item before placing it into labeled evidence trays. Once the drawer was empty, I pulled harder. The entire drawer came free. Behind it was a thin wooden panel almost perfectly matched to the surrounding oak. Without knowing it existed, no one would ever notice it. Melissa smiled faintly. "Your father really knew woodworking." I reached inside the small notch Dad had described. The panel lifted away. Behind it was a narrow compartment almost 3 feet deep. Not filled with cash, not jewelry, not dramatic secrets, just boxes, neatly labeled. Exactly the way Dad organized everything. Box 1, family loans. Box 2, bank statements. Box 3, correspondence. Box 4, estate notes. And resting underneath all of them, a single large manila envelope. No label, no handwriting, nothing. Melissa immediately stopped me. "Not yet." David photographed everything before anyone touched another item. Every box was assigned an evidence number. Every photograph recorded a timestamp. Every movement went into an evidence log. Watching the process reminded me why Dad had trusted documentation more than emotion. Facts don't become stronger because someone cries. They become stronger because they're preserved. Only after everything had been recorded did Melissa nod. Now! I picked up the first box. Inside were dozens of folders arranged chronologically. Each folder contained copies of canceled checks, loan agreements, bank deposit slips, letters between family members. Nothing looked sensational. Individually, almost every transaction appeared ordinary. David began organizing them by year. Within 20 minutes, patterns emerged. Tom had repeatedly borrowed money from family accounts. Every loan included repayment schedules. Almost none had been fully repaid. Instead, new loans quietly replaced old ones. Interest was ignored. Balances rolled forward. Paperwork became increasingly vague. The amounts slowly grew. David spread the documents across the conference table Melissa had arranged in the dining room. This isn't random. No. He pointed towards several folders. Every time Thomas experienced business problems, he pointed to another stack. Someone in the family provided temporary financial help. Another stack. And every repayment deadline somehow disappeared. Melissa added another observation. Notice who kept rewriting the agreements. I looked closely. Every updated repayment schedule had been drafted by Tom himself. Every revision sounded reasonable. Just 6 more months, 1 more extension, cash flow is tight. The project closes next quarter, unexpected expenses, promises, always promises. David leaned back. This explains how he maintained his reputation. How? He wasn't living beyond his means. He was living beyond everyone else's. The words hit harder than any accusation. Tom hadn't stolen in one dramatic moment. He had slowly normalized dependency, one favor at a time, one extension at a time, one conversation at a time. No wonder nobody questioned him. Nobody ever saw the whole picture, only pieces. Melissa opened another folder. This one's different. Inside were handwritten letters exchanged between my father and Tom over nearly 12 years. At first, they sounded like ordinary conversations between brothers. Thanks for helping. I'll make it right. Just give me another season. Business has been rough. Then the tone slowly changed. My father's responses became firmer, more direct. One letter caught my attention immediately. Dad had written, Tom, this isn't about the money anymore. It's about the fact that every time I ask for records, you tell me to trust you instead. Below it was Tom's reply. Families survive on trust, not spreadsheets. Melissa quietly looked at me. That's manipulation. I nodded, because suddenly I recognized it, not just in finances, in everything. Whenever I asked questions growing up, Tom never answered directly. He always made curiosity sound like betrayal. Don't you trust your family? Why are you keeping score? We're brothers. We're family. Stop acting like an auditor. I hadn't realized he'd been saying the same thing to Dad for years. David continued reviewing bank records. After nearly an hour, he circled several transactions. Kimberly. What? These are important. The checks weren't written to Tom. They were written to construction suppliers, equipment companies, insurance firms, property tax offices. Dad had often paid Tom's business expenses directly instead of handing him cash. That explained why outsiders never saw suspicious transfers. On paper, Dad looked like he was simply helping with invoices. David organized the timeline. The business experienced a downturn. Robert quietly covered operating expenses. Thomas promised reimbursement. Repayment rarely happened. Melissa added another note, and yet Thomas continued presenting himself as the family's financial rescuer. The irony was painful. The man everyone believed had saved the family financially had survived because my father quietly protected him. I looked toward the unopened manila envelope still resting on the table. "We still haven't opened that." Melissa nodded. "I know." David carefully closed the final ledger. "Before we do," he slid one document toward us. "This may explain why Robert finally decided to write that certified letter. It wasn't a bank statement. It wasn't a loan agreement. It was a one-page summary my father had typed for himself. Across the top he had written, "Why I can no longer stay silent." Beneath it was a numbered list. 1. Thomas never repaid what he promised. 2. He continues asking for control instead of accountability. 3. The family believes the opposite of what documents prove. Then came number 4. I felt my stomach tighten before I even finished reading. Thomas has begun changing the story about Kimberly. I looked at Melissa. "What does that mean?" She slowly reached for the unmarked manila envelope. "I think." She turned it over carefully. "The answer isn't in the financial records. It's in here." She opened the metal clasp. A smaller sealed envelope slid onto the table. Across the front in my father's handwriting were 7 words. "Open only after reviewing every financial record." Dad wanted us to understand the money first, because whatever waited inside wasn't really about money at all. For several seconds, none of us reached for the smaller envelope. It sat in the middle of the dining room table, surrounded by 12 years of ledgers, canceled checks, repayment schedules, and handwritten correspondence. Dad had been deliberate. He wanted whoever found this to understand one thing first. Money had never been the real problem. Control was. Melissa looked around the room before speaking. "I'd like to finish documenting everything before we open it." David nodded immediately. "I agree." Neither of them sounded excited. They sounded careful. That difference mattered. Because if the last few weeks had taught me anything, it was that careful people build cases. Careless people build stories. An hour later, every document had been photographed, indexed, scanned, and sealed in evidence folders. Only then did Melissa slide the smaller envelope toward me. "It belongs to you." I broke the seal. Inside were only 3 items: a folded letter, a USB flash drive, and 1 old photograph. I looked at the photograph first. It showed my father and Uncle Tom standing outside Tom's construction company almost 15 years earlier. Both of them were smiling. Both looked younger. On the back, Dad had written a date. Nothing else. "Why keep this?" I asked. Melissa pointed toward something in the background. "Zoom in." David scanned the photograph and enlarged it on his laptop. At first, I didn't understand. Then I noticed a white pickup truck parked behind them. Its license plate was clearly visible. So was the company warehouse. Melissa frowned. "Interesting." "What?" "This photograph was taken on the exact day listed on one of those repayment agreements." I still didn't understand. "The truck?" "No." She pointed again. "The warehouse." Behind the men hung a large banner announcing the grand opening of Tom's newest office. David immediately searched through the financial folders. After a minute, he found what he was looking for. "Here." He placed a construction invoice beside the photograph. The invoice was dated the same week, paid in full, by Robert Simpson, not Tom. The amount made me blink. $48,000. Dad hadn't merely loaned Tom money, he had quietly financed the opening of Tom's second business location. Tom had spent years telling relatives that he had built everything himself. The paperwork told a different story. Melissa carefully unfolded Dad's second letter. Unlike the certified letter, this one wasn't addressed to me. It carried a different title, "For whoever needs to know the truth." She read silently for several moments before handing it to me. Dad wrote that he never regretted helping his brother. He regretted allowing gratitude to be rewritten into entitlement. Then came a paragraph that made my chest tighten. Thomas no longer believes the family will love him without the image he has built. Every lie since then has protected that image more than the people inside it. That explains something I'd never understood. Tom wasn't chasing money anymore. He already had a successful business. He already owned a beautiful home. His children were grown. His reputation, however, that was everything. If the family learned Dad had quietly financed his success for years, if they learned he'd manipulated financial records, if they learned he'd isolated Dad during hospice, the image he'd spent decades protecting would collapse. Not because of one mistake, because of a long pattern. Melissa placed the USB drive on the table. "Let's see what's on this." David connected it to his laptop. Only one folder appeared. Personal recordings. There were 4 audio files. Dad had labeled them by date. We opened the final recording first. Static crackled through the speakers. Then my father's voice filled the room, weak, tired, but unmistakably clear. "If you're listening to this," he coughed. Then something happened exactly the way I feared. I felt tears forming again. Dad continued, "I am making this recording because conversations become arguments. Paper can disappear, but voices are harder to explain away." There was a pause. Then another voice entered the recording. "Tom, I'm trying to protect this family." Dad answered quietly, "No, you're trying to protect yourself." The room became completely silent. For nearly 20 minutes we listened. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just 2 aging brothers having the conversation they should have had years earlier. Tom admitted he still intended to repay everything. Dad replied that repayment was no longer the issue. "You've asked everyone to trust you," while making sure nobody sees the records. Tom sighed. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. No. If Kimberly starts asking questions after you're gone, everything we've built falls apart." Dad answered with a sentence I will never forget. "Then perhaps it wasn't built honestly enough." The recording ended. Nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, David closed the laptop. "That's incredibly powerful." Melissa shook her head. "Emotionally, yes. But legally," she tapped the table, "the ledgers matter more." I looked surprised. "Really?" "Absolutely. Why? Because Thomas can argue about context. He can argue about tone. He can argue about memory." She placed her hand on the stacks of documents. "He can't argue with his own signatures." That was classic Melissa, always separating emotion from evidence. By late afternoon, she had organized every document into a chronological presentation. The financial records, the correspondence, the hospice notes, the USPS documentation, the recordings, everything fit together. No gaps, no dramatic leaps, just one consistent timeline. The next morning, probate mediation began. Nearly every branch of the Simpson family attended. Cousins, aunts, uncles, people I hadn't seen in years. Most greeted Uncle Tom warmly. He smiled back exactly as he always had, confident, comfortable, respected. When he noticed me entering with Melissa and several document boxes, his smile faded just slightly. The mediator welcomed everyone before explaining the process. "We're here to resolve outstanding estate concerns." Tom spoke first. "I'm disappointed we've reached this point." "So am I answered. "I never wanted this." He looked around the room. "Our brother wouldn't want us fighting." For a brief moment, several relatives nodded sympathetically. Then Melissa quietly stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone. She simply placed one binder in front of every participant. This isn't an argument. She opened the first page. It's a timeline. The room grew noticeably quieter. One by one, relatives began turning pages. Certified mail records, hospice documentation, visitor logs, loan agreements, canceled checks, signed repayment schedules. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued, because every page answered the question raised by the page before it. Halfway through the presentation, I looked across the table at Uncle Tom. For the first time in my life, he wasn't trying to convince anyone. He was silently watching documents do what decades of persuasion no longer could. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. The only sound in the mediation room was the quiet turning of paper. I watched relatives move from one document to the next. No dramatic reactions, no gasps, just slow, careful reading. That was exactly how Melissa had planned it. She hadn't built a presentation around accusations. She had built it around chronology. One document answered the next. One fact explained another. By the time everyone reached the final section, there was very little left to debate. The mediator, Judge Eleanor Whitmore, retired from the probate bench, but now serving as a private mediator, closed her own binder and looked around the room. "I'd like to ask a simple question." She turned toward Uncle Tom. "Mr. Simpson." "Yes. Do you dispute that these signatures are yours?" She slid 3 loan agreements across the table. Tom adjusted his glasses. He studied them carefully. Finally, he answered. "No." "Do you dispute that these checks were paid on your behalf?" Another pause. "No." "Do you dispute that your brother repeatedly requested repayment?" Tom rubbed his forehead. "No." Judge Whitmore nodded. "So the disagreement is not whether these events occurred. It's how they should be interpreted." Tom looked relieved. "Exactly." He leaned forward. "My brother helped me. Families help each other. I never denied that." His voice remained calm. "I intended to repay everything. I just ran out of time." Nobody interrupted him. He continued. "My business nearly failed after the recession. Robert knew that. He told me not to worry. He believed in me. I believed part of that. Dad probably had believed in him for years." The judge turned toward Melissa. "Ms. Grant." Melissa stood without opening another folder. "Mr. Simpson is correct." Several relatives looked surprised. She continued. "Robert Simpson absolutely helped his brother." She paused. "That is not the issue before us." She walked slowly to the center of the room. "The issue is what happened afterward." She pointed toward the timeline. For over a decade, Robert continued extending loans. Thomas continued requesting extensions. That by itself is not fraud. Tom nodded quickly. "Exactly." Melissa continued speaking in the same measured tone. "But while accepting Robert's financial assistance, Thomas simultaneously represented himself to the family as the person financially supporting Robert." The room became quiet again. She opened another page. "Relatives were repeatedly told Robert depended on Thomas." She opened another. "Medical staff documented Robert managing his own affairs." Another. "Relatives were told Kimberly rarely visited." She pointed toward the hospice logs. "The records show 23 visits." Another. "Thomas claimed Robert canceled the certified letter." She looked toward the USPS documentation. "The records show Robert took additional steps to preserve that letter if delivery failed." She closed the binder. "This case is not about one lie. It's about a pattern." I looked across the room. My cousin Emily slowly lowered her eyes. My Aunt Susan quietly wiped away tears. Neither of them looked angry. They looked embarrassed. Not because they'd done anything wrong, because they had trusted the loudest voice instead of asking for proof. Judge Whitmore folded her hands. "Mr. Simpson." Tom nodded. "I have one final question." "Go ahead." Did you destroy the envelope Kimberly's father addressed to her for the first time that day? Tom didn't answer immediately. He stared at the table, then at me, then back at the judge. Finally, he spoke. Yes. The word barely rose above a whisper. Nobody moved. I did. He closed his eyes briefly. I believed reading it would destroy this family. I felt something strange. Not satisfaction, not anger, just relief. The truth had finally been spoken without anyone forcing it. Judge Whitmore remained composed. Why didn't you simply give Kimberly the letter? Tom's shoulders sagged. Because I knew Robert had started putting everything together. He'd connected the loans, the records, the conversations. He was going to tell her everything. He looked at me. I thought... His voice cracked. I thought if the letter disappeared, the rest would never matter, I answered quietly. You underestimated my father. A faint, sad smile crossed his face. I did. The judge asked another question. Did you attempt to access USPS archive records after Robert's funeral? Tom slowly nodded. Yes. Why? Because I realized too late. Robert probably anticipated what I might do. No one in the room seemed shocked anymore, only tired. Very tired. Judge Whitmore spent the next 30 minutes reviewing the proposed settlement Melissa had prepared. It was surprisingly restrained. There was no demand to seize Tom's business, no request for punitive damages, no attempt to publicly humiliate him. Instead, the proposal required 4 things. First, the estate accounting would be corrected to accurately reflect every documented loan and repayment. Second, outstanding obligations owed to Robert's estate would be formally acknowledged. Third, future administration of remaining estate matters would be transferred entirely out of Tom's control. Fourth, every beneficiary would receive identical copies of the financial records and supporting documentation. No single person would ever control the narrative again. Judge Whitmore looked at me. Ms. Simpson? Yes. Your attorney has left several legal claims unfiled. I know. You understand you may be entitled to pursue additional civil remedies. I do. Why aren't you... The room waited for my answer. I looked down at my father's final letter resting beside my notebook. Then I answered honestly. My father spent his last weeks trying to make sure the truth survived. He never asked me to spend the rest of my life punishing his brother. I turned toward Tom. I won't protect your lies. I also won't build my future around your mistakes. He lowered his head. I understand. I hope you do. Judge Whitmore smiled gently. That is a thoughtful distinction. Melissa quietly squeezed my shoulder. The settlement was signed that afternoon. Tom signed without negotiating a single provision. When everything was finished, relatives slowly began leaving the conference room. Several stopped to apologize. Some admitted they should have listened sooner. Others confessed they had repeated Tom's version of events without ever asking where it came from. I accepted every sincere apology, but I didn't promise that things would return to the way they had been, because they couldn't. Trust isn't restored by saying, I'm sorry. It's rebuilt by living differently. As Melissa packed the last binder into her briefcase, the probate clerk approached me carrying a small sealed box. Miss Simpson, yes. This was found in your father's safe deposit inventory. I frowned. I thought everything had already been released. So did we. She smiled apologetically. It had been placed in the section reserved for personal effects rather than estate documents. She handed me the box. Attached to the lid was a small handwritten label. In my father's familiar handwriting were 6 simple words. Open after everything else is finished. I looked at Melissa. She smiled. I think your father still has one last conversation planned. I didn't open the box until 2 days later, not because I was afraid of what might be inside, because for the first time in weeks, nothing was chasing me. The mediation was over. The estate accounting had been corrected. Every beneficiary had received identical copies of the financial records. The probate court formally approved the revised distribution, reflecting every documented loan, every repayment that had been made, and every outstanding obligation that remained. No one was publicly shamed, but the official record now matched the truth. Uncle Tom resigned as co-personal representative of the estate. Melissa became the sole administrator for the remaining probate matters until everything was finalized. There were no appeals, no angry letters, no dramatic courtroom scenes, just signatures, deadlines, receipts. The kind of ending my father probably would have appreciated. 6 months passed. Autumn arrived in Columbus. The maple trees outside my apartment had turned deep shades of red and gold. Life slowly settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around grief. I returned to my accounting practice full-time. Clients still brought me balance sheets and tax questions. The work hadn't changed, but I had. Whenever someone apologized for asking too many questions about their finances, I found myself smiling. Questions protect people. I heard my father's voice every time I said it. Melissa and I still met for coffee once a month. Our conversations rarely focused on the estate anymore. Sometimes we talked about books, sometimes politics, sometimes nothing important at all. One afternoon, she looked at me over her coffee cup. You know something? What? You've stopped talking about proving your uncle wrong. I thought about that. She was right. At first, every decision I made had been driven by what Tom had done. Now, he wasn't the center of the story anymore. Dad was, and so was I. That realization felt lighter than I expected. A week later, Daniel Ruiz stopped by my office during his lunch break. He carried a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. I figured accountants probably forget to eat. I laughed. Sometimes we do. We sat outside on a bench overlooking the courthouse square. For a while, we simply watched people walking through the afternoon sunshine. Eventually, I asked him something that had been on my mind for months. Why did you knock on my door that evening? You could have ignored the whole thing. Daniel looked down at his coffee. Your father reminded me of mine. How he believed ordinary people should do ordinary things well. He smiled. When your dad mailed that certified letter, he thanked every postal employee who helped him. He thanked you. He said something I've never forgotten. I smiled. I think I know what it was. Daniel laughed. Go ahead. Paper remembers better than people do. That too. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a small note. I wrote it down after he left because I didn't want to forget. He handed it to me. My father's words were written in Daniel's neat handwriting. The mail isn't just paper. Sometimes it's the only witness that doesn't choose sides. I read it twice, then folded the note carefully. He really said that he did. I've delivered mail for 24 years. I've never forgotten it. Neither would I. That evening, I finally opened the small box from the safe deposit inventory. Inside wasn't another financial record or another secret. There was an old family photograph. I had never seen it before. Dad was standing in our backyard. I couldn't have been older than 7. I was sitting on his shoulders laughing while holding a tiny birdhouse we'd built together. Written on the back in the same steady handwriting I'd recognized my entire life was a short note. Kimberly, if this reaches you, it means you've already learned something difficult about people. I hope you also remember something important about yourself. You were never chosen because you were easy to manipulate. You were always chosen because I trusted your judgment. Don't confuse forgiveness with renewed access. Some people deserve peace. Not everyone deserves another opportunity to break your trust. Love them if you can. Pray for them if you wish. But build your future with people who don't require you to ignore the truth. I'm already proud of you. Love, Dad. I cried harder reading those few paragraphs than I had during the mediation. Not because they reopened old wounds, because they closed them. A month later, several relatives invited me to Thanksgiving dinner. For years, Uncle Tom had hosted every holiday. This time, he declined the invitation himself. He sent me a handwritten card instead. There were no excuses. No attempts to justify what he'd done. Only one sentence stood out. I spent years protecting the version of myself I wanted everyone to believe. I should have spent those years becoming that person instead. I appreciated the honesty. I also left the card unanswered. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Dad's final note had changed the way I understood forgiveness. I no longer believed forgiveness required restoring someone's place in my life. I could genuinely hope Tom found peace. I could also choose not to place my future in his hands again. Those two ideas were not contradictions, they were boundaries. On Thanksgiving afternoon, I brought Dad's photograph to the small gathering. My cousins laughed at how tiny I looked sitting on his shoulders. My Aunt Susan quietly admitted something. Robert always kept copies of everything. I smiled. He trusted paperwork. She shook her head. No. She looked at the picture again. He trusted people. He just understood that even good people sometimes forget. Driving home that evening, I realized the certified letter had never truly been my father's greatest gift. The letter opened the door. The documents proved the truth. The law corrected the record. But none of those things healed me by themselves. Healing began the moment I stopped trying to win an argument and started allowing evidence to carry the weight. My father had prepared carefully because he knew grief could cloud memory. He understood that truth doesn't need to shout. It simply needs to survive long enough to be seen. And thanks to one certified letter, one honest mail carrier, one patient attorney, and one father who believed integrity was worth documenting, it finally did. Some of the deepest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people we expected to protect us. When that happens, it's natural to question yourself before you question them. But healthy boundaries begin when we stop accepting guilt in place of evidence and stop confusing family loyalty with unconditional access to our lives. Seeking the truth is not revenge. Holding someone accountable is not cruelty. And forgiveness, when it comes, does not require returning to the same relationship that caused the harm. If you've ever been manipulated by someone in your own family, I hope this story reminds you that patience, documentation, and calm persistence are often more powerful than anger. Justice doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like the truth being recorded accurately, decisions being made wisely, and your peace no longer depending on someone else's approval. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you loved? What would you have done if you were in Kimberly's position? Share your perspective in the comments. Your story may encourage someone else who is going through something similar. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience, justice, and healing, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and joined us for the next one. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.